vision. It does not mean that we don't look back to our past and to the history and where we've come. That's part of the journey. But the church is its best when it looks to reaching out and moving forward. And that's part of what we're involved with today. I'm a former pastor, former Lutheran pastor, and I always like to begin remembering back to the time that I had to teach congregations and confirmands with a little bit of a pop quiz. What I want to ask you this morning is, the biblical writers, the biblical witness, when they describe spirit, they describe it as coming to the people of God in two forms. And I'm asking, what are those forms? And I'm going to give you a bit of a hint that it is not dove. At the baptism of Jesus, the Spirit descends like a dove, but the Spirit doesn't have the shape or the form of dove. But there are two forms that the Spirit is witnessed as coming to the people of God. Does anybody know what those forms are? Yes?
Cloud and fire.
Fire and cloud is close. The other is wind or breath. Moving air. What I find particularly interesting about that is that fire and wind do not have specific shape. They are dynamic forms that are always changing, always moving. And in fact, if you try to give fire and wind form, if you enclose fire, what happens? It goes out. If you enclose wind, what happens? It stops being wind. It's a reminder to us that as people of the Spirit, the form that we choose to house the people of God always needs to change and move and modify based on where the Spirit of God is moving you. It's that idea of renewal. If we are people of Spirit, the forms that we choose to house our ministries are going to change because the Spirit is dynamic and it moves us to different places in different ways over time. Interestingly enough, the things of liturgy, water, fire, the spirit of proclamation, and the sustenance that we share around the table of the altar in our worship space are all things that grow and move. The people of God are people of journey. And so as we look to master plan, it is helpful for us to remember that the forms that we create are useful, but they need to change with us as the Spirit calls us not only to remember the past, but to move into the future. Church growth gurus. So I've been doing this a long time and tracking trends of the church, and there are 7 things that are important for church growth. There is the presence of the facility. So do people know that you're there? Do you have adequate parking? The analogy I often use is I really like Arby's when I go for fast food. But if I drive up to an Arby's and there are 20 cars and there are only 3 cars at another fast food, I'm not committed enough to Arby's to stand in line that long. And for people who are unchurched, churches experience the same sort of thing. If a visitor comes for the first time and can't find a place to park, they may not come back. They may not even come inside. Is there a visible, clear entry? This is really important. If you think about it from the standpoint of the person who comes to the church for help, they may look for every barrier they can find to not get that help. Having a clear pathway to allow those people as easy of an access inside to get the good things that you have to offer is important. It is a symbol of welcome and a symbol of open doors, letting people know that you are not a closed-off community for your own benefit, but for the benefit of all God's people. Having a place for hospitality. I have worked with a lot of congregations that have dynamic worship. And yet, what helps to bring people back is the personal connection of God's people to God's people. You can have a beautiful place of worship, and if you are not actively able to make that personal connection to people, they may not come back. Creating places of hospitality is important for a congregation that is hospitable. You have to have a place to do that. I often like to caution people that just because you have a place of hospitality, if you're not hospitable, doesn't matter, right? So it's not like Field of Dreams. If you build it, they will come. You have to do the work inside of it, but you need a place to do that. Provisions for parenting. The churches that have seen over the last 30 years phenomenal growth of the congregation, even if their theology may not be quite what I would prefer or a Lutheran church might prefer, there are things that those congregations do very well, and the two that usually are present is hospitality. When I was a pastor in Racine, you couldn't have a church event without coffee and kringle. It's not about the food. It is that food connects people to people. It's a vehicle for us to begin conversations. So a place of hospitality and generosity is important, but also those churches cater to young families. They make it easy for young families to come and stay. Ample room in the worship space, generous seating. If it's kind of like the parking. If people come into your building and can't find a place to sit in worship where they can experience the gifts that your community offers up, they may feel that there is not room for them. And finally, technologies that support the actions of the church. And that comes in a variety of different forms. We'll talk a little bit about that. Interestingly enough, for schools, it is the same 7 things that facilitate the growth of schools. And we'll talk more about that. For worship and for education, it is important that people know you're here. You have a phenomenal location. And your church building stands out to the road. I haven't been by here recently at night to see if it is lit. This is a LCMS church project that built a new place of worship in Indiana. And they were insistent that they wanted the church to have presence. They are on the intersection of two county roads in the flatness of northern Indiana. And they decided they were going to build a worship space that would light at night, and they were going to put a spire on the building that is 75 feet tall so that you can see it from a long way off. So it calls people and draws them. I worked with this church in Madison right around the time that you built Trinity Café. On a major boulevard, it had a beautiful 1950s style building. The problem was that as the surrounding area grew, this complex, which was relatively new, dwarfed the congregation, and nobody knew that they were there. As a part of the work that we did, we provided a gable out to the street with a portal to be able to see into the worship that could light at night. We matched their 1950s architecture beautifully, and the church decided that they wanted to send a clear message that they were not just a Lutheran church of the 50s. And so they put a dynamic cross in front of that window that could be inspirational for them on the inside and visible to people on the road. One of my pastor friends in the Madison area said he was almost in a car accident because he was driving by the church and showing his daughters the cross that this community put on their building, and he wasn't paying attention. Signage helps, but people tend to look beyond signs. Stop looking at signs. I know all the buildings that I pass by every day from work. I don't look at the signs anymore. But I pass by artwork and landscape and architecture, and we continually re-look at those types of spaces because they are engaging in a different way than signage is. How your building opens up to the community. This is a church in Waukesha that built their original building as kind of a big box enclosed. And when they put a gathering space onto the building, they were insistent that the building had to be open and transparent so that it didn't provide the proclamation of barrier. With schools, the same sort of thing is important. Having the presence and proclaiming to the surrounding community that the school is welcoming, open, inviting, and we'll talk a little bit more about the actual entry. But having that kind of presence is important also for the school buildings. For worship, adequate parking, the rule of thumb is one stall for every 2 to 2.5 seats. Back when I was a kid, my family of 5 took one car to worship, and so the church at that time didn't need a lot of parking. That was the trend. I know families of 5 that end up with 3 cars at worship. If you don't have street parking, it is even more important to have this kind of a ratio in your space in order to attract people and give them easy access, particularly for visitors. Providing convenience for people that have a more difficult time in parking. We provide all these types of parking opportunities at various locations. Some churches don't do all of them, but thinking how you can make it easier for people. The one I like is this. just a little story. I worked with St. Stephen's Catholic Church in building their new building. They were by the airport. Now they're down off of 94 going south. And the pastor, the priest at the church, had a sign like this. And one day I came to a meeting and I parked in his stall. And I said, I dare you. Give me an opportunity. For education, those needs become even more critical. Having safety and control. The drop-off of students is incredibly complex for most school communities. And thinking about how that works in a way that is safe and easy for people to follow. We often have to work with both bus drop-off and pickup and car drop-off and pickup. That becomes challenging. Also, how you deal with drop-off versus walk-in, because every school does that a little bit differently and sometimes differently with different age groups. And then providing, again, that sense of convenience. The entry into worship is important. It is a symbol to people of your desire to have them come in. This is a church up in the Hubertus area that built a carport that was a symbol of entry and convenience of entry. But even more importantly, all of the functional doors are covered and around this corner. And they wanted to create a door on the front of their worship that would be large enough to see from the road. They had a 40-acre site. The roadway was a long ways away. And so they created these generous doors. These don't meet exit code. But on a Sunday morning, when the weather is nice, that one day in Wisconsin, they can open those doors and people driving by encounter their building and their entry with open doors, a symbol that even non-members are welcome. This is a church in Ohio who were so committed to opening up their building that they carved out an opening into their worship so that people in the neighborhood, it's a downtown church right across from a school, anybody driving by this church can understand that this building is not walled off. Our church, as Lutherans, was born in a castle. Castles are meant to keep people out. We have a different understanding of opening up the doors and allowing people to go in, and the additional benefit of an approach of this kind of transparency is that it reminds those of us that are actively engaged in the ministries of the church or worship that our job as Christians, our calling, does not end inside the building. It starts and looks outward to new ministry opportunities outside of the church. How people come in can be and should be a beautiful welcoming. I often say, liturgy doesn't start in the worship space. It starts on the site. It starts down the road if your building is visible from down the road. All of that helps people prepare. This is a church in Madison that did not have a great entry. In fact, they had a very confusing entry. And so they chose not only to create a beautiful threshold that would clearly call out where people were supposed to enter. If you didn't go through this door, you ended up in the dungeon of the building. It was like a catacomb. People got lost. And this entry before this addition didn't look like the main entry. And so visitors were completely ending up in the basement of the church, wandering around, not knowing where they were supposed to go. they also created this outdoor courtyard that could be a place of inspiration and outdoor worship and devotion. And as a part of that, they had a challenge of having to move people between levels. They had some changes over the years on their site that moved the main entry from one side of the building to the other. And so they knew they needed to provide easy wayfinding between levels and created a beautiful stair. They incorporated a brand new elevator that provided the convenience for people that couldn't navigate steps. If people get lost, their experience of your church is confusion and kind of insider mentality, right? We want them to feel welcome and have clear pathways that make them feel like insiders the minute they enter the building. The same is true for schools, but additionally, schools have to think about security and control. Oftentimes, school drop-offs are separated by age, depending on what breadth of age groups your school works with. And we have to make that drop-off particularly convenient for young children and for parents tending to young children. I'm always amazed at how much stuff young parents have to tote around and have to store when they're in either church buildings or school buildings. We have to make that easy for them. For places of hospitality, both with education and with worship, those spaces need to be generous, not only in square footage, but they need to be generous with the things that sustain community. Natural light, volume. I can tell you as an architect, I've worked with a number of churches that had very low hospitality space ceilings. Those spaces feel full long before the floor plan gets filled up. The volume of that building, while it can be excessive, and that's not good, we have to give enough generosity to the places of hospitality that people feel comfortable in those spaces, that we provide them with opportunities to mingle where there is not furniture, and to have places of respite where you can sit down and have a little bit of a private conversation. Those places of hospitality have changed in my lifetime. Back when I was a kid, the paradigm of church hospitality and fellowship was the VFW and the supper club. Not bad things. But younger communities younger people are more accustomed to more fluid places of engagement. If we want to retain and have those people feel at home, we have to give them places that feel familiar. And Café, bookstore, Barnes & Noble, Noodles, whatever those ages are used to hanging out with, the more we can make the spaces fluid and familiar, the more easy it is to retain those people because they feel at home. Having plenty of natural light so that the space doesn't feel like a cave. The technologies of education. Also, in the last 30 years that I've been practicing architecture, it's amazing how much technology has changed for proclamation. I remember going to a church and doing this type of presentation 20 years ago with Post-it pad notebooks, having to write and all, and not being able to really show good image. Part of the proclamation of the church is not just spoken word, but communication. if we think about it as communication. Technology in and of itself, like the building, is not the end. It is the tool to adequately communicate the promise of God. In our education spaces, good lighting is critical. Studies have shown that test scores in school classrooms with good lighting as opposed to poor lighting improve 10 to 20%. Same teaching, but the environment for education changes how people take in information and retain it. The same is true for worship. Creating spaces that actively connect people to sensory environment. And I don't mean it has to be, like a water park, right? We don't have to be, that animate. But everybody learns and takes in information in different ways. And if we provide worship that greets people and engages people on multiple levels of sensory experience, we don't leave anybody off the chart. Over the course of my practice, I have been to Latino masses. When those churches do it well, it doesn't matter if I can understand the language. I still come away with something rewarding, even as a non-Spanish speaker, right? For people that have different ways of taking in information, the more our churches can provide stimulus across the entire spectrum of human sensory experience, the more likely we are to connect with those people. And of course, technology in worship has changed. I stopped in your worship space coming in and saw how you have used technology and lighting to beautify your space and create something that is warm and welcoming in that place of worship. I have not been to a worship in your Bridge Trinity experience, and as a part of this, I'm hoping to be able to see that. I often say, it's not possible for me to design for people I have not worshiped with. I have worshiped with you in the past, but it's been some time. How we do sensory experience, I don't know if some of you are familiar, this is St. Luke's in Waukesha, a church that was built in the new cathedral style. Interestingly enough, lots of light in the front, no light in the back. When you were in worship at this location, you felt like you were at a theater, observing worship. Part of that renovation simply balanced out the light in the space so that everybody in worship felt like they had a place in the sun. And worship then became not just something that we observe in the front, but something that even the community attending worship is actively involved in. Luther said, right, we don't practice the Mass apart from the assembly. The lighting of the church helps everybody in the church feel like they are central to the action around the altar. And that church in Ohio, as they built a new church beyond a fire that destroyed a historic building, they were committed to provide technologies and art that would engage people on multiple levels. It's hard to see over here. You can't see the pipe organ. and there's a stained glass window on this side, but they incorporated stained glass, tapestry, a number of things to stimulate the artistic minds of people. All of those things are a part of technology that helps us be the church. When we talk about technology, we often think that it's just flat screen, this type of experience. There was a time when lighting was technology, when we saw lighting as technology, when we saw pipe organ as technology. The church has always engaged in using the technology of the time to convey the promise of God's people. Ample room. The rule of thumb is 50-80. If your worship space is sized so that you only have 50% of it filled on a regular basis, I mean, there are special occasions where the church is underfilled. But if on a regular Sunday, the experience is that the church has less than 50% of the space filled, the perception by visitors is that the church is dying. By the same token, if your church is filled routinely beyond 80%, the perception is that there is no room for the visitor. And the experience of the visitor becomes difficult. Because, of course, people that don't know each other need more room to feel comfortable. If I sat down next to some of you as an unknown, right? It's a different kind of an experience than if somebody is sitting next to you that you know. Chancel spaces have to have a lot more room than they did back 100 years ago. I'm always amazed when I go into chancels of old buildings how tiny they are. Same thing with narthex spaces. The church now has lots more that needs to happen in our chancel spaces in order to convey the message of grace to people. The breadth of the chancel. This is a church that in building their chancel wanted choir up front. They had a praise band, and they wanted enough generosity to the chancel that when the praise band is set up, the traditional symbols of sacrament were not overwhelmed. And that is all a matter of breadth. This church in Ohio, you can see the effect of opening up the building and the art glass and all of the art. But part of what they also wanted to do was create the ability to flex their space, to be able to accommodate more people than usually was their experience in worship. Because they're a church of the arts in the area, and so they sometimes routinely have 150 people, but at times their space can grow to needing 300. We designed a space for 300, and the only way that we could make that space feel comfortable then for the 150 was to be able to modulate how seating could be removed or added and not feel like the space was overwhelming or undersized. How we connect people to the means of grace and to each other. Fan seating in and of itself has some benefits, but the reason we often fan seating in worship spaces is to get proximity. If this seating, which keeps everybody within 65 feet of the altar, if that seating was lined up in a more traditional arrangement, people would be 120 feet away from the means of grace. And part of what we need to do as worshiping Christians is recognize sacramental theology is about people providing sacrament. You have to be able to see faces. You have to be able to see facial features. After 65 feet, you're not able to understand that it is the person that brings the grace of God. Ample room in classrooms means that there is enough room to allow the activity of the classroom. That has also changed over the last 50 years. Many schools still use desks, but it is much more likely, especially with younger children, that we incorporate and indoctrinate the education that the school brings with activity and movement, with color, with light. Hallways. I often forget how important hallways are to the educational experience. Those third spaces, as architects call them, outside of the spaces that we use, are opportunities for our children to have community outside of the formal structure of classrooms. It is an opportunity for our children to encounter God, to learn about self, and to encounter the other. This is an interesting school. One of the things that our school designers in our firm have started to incorporate into their designs is the learning street. It is outside of the classroom a generous area that can be used for informal teaching and for building the community of the children of the school. Ample room for all of the ministries of the school, everything from art to science to recreation. In provisioning for parents, the outdoor learning experience or recreation experience is important on a number of levels. It's important for children. But more importantly, playgrounds. I remember working in my career with churches that said, well, you know, we want a beautiful site. We don't want to put up a playground. It looks messy. It is a symbol that children are important to you when parents drive by and can see a safe and animate play area. And also provisions for being able to tend to parents in the educational spaces. Places that parents can gather and meet and learn as they drop off children. I worked with a church in Madison, and the pastor, they had a preschool, and the pastor said, one day he was greeting parents as children were being dropped off. Parents left. And then he went to get a cup of coffee at a local coffee place, and all of the parents that had dropped off kids at the preschool were at the coffee house. And he said, why don't we provide coffee for the parents and keep them on our site longer so that we can minister to them? That's part of the reason you have Trinity Café, right? In regard to schools, particularly with early childhood or younger grade levels, the top two concerns, this is from a study done by the NACCRRA. Don't ask me what all that stands for. Top two concerns, the quality of the education and the cost. But when asked how parents define quality, it is not just the curriculum. Small class sizes experienced staff. The curriculum does matter. How much parent involvement there is in that educational process. And then the learning opportunity through learning environment. The environment matters to parents. I have been in schools that looked like they were not safe places for kids. We need to make sure our schools feel current and safe and stimulate our youngest. They need to be generous, engaging, clean, safe, and have adequate places for children to play. We tend to not think about play areas as learning opportunities, but they are. It's a way to reinforce what happens in the classroom. So those spaces need to be ordered and bright and clean and designed for children. In worship, providing for parenting is critical through a variety of different experiences. Not only for children in worship, but for adults too. When I talk about parenting with the churches that I work with, the immediate need that comes to mind are the needs of children and young children. But I like to talk about parenting as custodial care for the entire community, because children need special care. But the whole breadth of the range of adults need special care as well. We have people that have difficulty walking or difficulty seeing. Sometimes that's temporary. Sometimes that's long-term. We need to create places where families, this is what's called a family restroom. Some of this is required by code, but not always. If you have a child or a spouse that needs assistance in a restroom by somebody of a different gender, we need to be able to provide a place where that can occur with dignity. And that's the important part of it, is to give people that have any variation of ability the dignity to feel that they are no different than the rest of the breadth of community. We all have differing needs. The code is woefully inadequate in regard to restrooms for women. There's a thing in Wisconsin called potty parity. I don't know if that's an official term or if that's what architects talk about. But it means that we have to provide the same number for each gender within the code. But I always like to oversize the women's restrooms because it just takes longer. And very often, if you just provide the same facility for men and for women, we end up with this kind of situation of woefully inadequate women's restrooms. And of course, then, places that parents can tend to children, and particularly mothers that need to nurse children. First time I ever did a walkthrough of a church building, it was a 1950s church, and it's the first time I ever remember being in a women's room. I probably was when I was a baby or a little child, but I'd never really been into a women's restroom, and I remember walking in and going, wow, they have couches. In the baby boom of the 50s, churches understood if you want women to stay at church and they have children to tend to with nursing, you have to provide a safe and discreet place for that to happen, or then women need to leave. Providing that type of place for young mothers is really critical to keep young families at church. If you don't provide it, some other church will. Thinking about the entire breadth of custodial care is a part of what we have to do as a church. About a year ago, I did a visioning workshop with a church in Illinois, and I said, well, maybe not the dog. Somebody from the back of the auditorium, it was like an auditorium-style church, somebody from the back said, what do you mean not the dog? It was a woman with a support dog. She said, my dog comes to church because I need it. So maybe the dog. Thinking about that breadth of human experience is a part of our caring for the human family. So, with that, let's take a very short break. Get up, stand, stretch if you need to use the restroom, if you need to grab something from the hospitality center, go ahead, and then we'll come back for the discussion.